Hey everyone, Anarchy here, and this is another episode of Anarch Abridged. In this series of videos, what I've been doing is going back over some of my video essays and summarizing them in a little bit easier to understand terminology, trying to bring them down to the level of, say, a lecture. That makes this the third in the lecture series. I recommend you go watch the first two if this is the first one you've seen, but this will also have some standalone value. The topic I'm going to be covering today is what is anarchy in my conception? And apparently Morticia is going to be joining us. Isn't that right, Morticia? Never mind. She's lost interest. Great. Now the other cat's here. I'm trying to record, y'all. Come on. They just decided that I started recording, so now they needed to be here as well. Anyway, in the previous part of this video series, I was talking about how anarchism is related to complex systems analysis and how anarchism actually advocates all of the fundamental principles that are needed for a system to exhibit what is called emergence. If you want to know why it's important that a system demonstrate emergence, you can go back to part 2 of the lecture series. Here, I'm just going to take that part for granted. However, what I will be doing is returning to the 5 values that we set out in the last part of this video series. And those values are freedom, solidarity, equality, the unique, and ownness. The reason these values will be important again in this part is because what I plan to do is take each of these values and look at the interplay of each of them. That is to say, look at how freedom and equality interact. Look at how the unique and solidarity interact and things like that. The reason why I think this is a valuable thought experiment is because what I found when I did this analysis was that almost all of the principles that anarchists have laid out as being necessary in order to achieve an anarchistic society of some kind arose out of all of these interplays. Another reason why I think this approach is preferable to me is because I can't really lay out to you what anarchy, which is an emergent phenomena of an anarchic system, might actually look like. It's impossible to tell you what its exact features are going to be, how they're going to structure their society, how it's going to overcome particular difficulties. However, if we have confirmed that these anarchic principles, which I laid out in part 2 of this series, are indeed those political principles that might underlie an emergent system, then we can also know that those principles are going to be present in their many interfaces in an anarchy that might arise out of that anarchic system. So what this does is it gives us some rational guidance into what kinds of features we might expect to be in that anarchy without saying what it will precisely look like. That is to say, this allows us to talk about what anarchy might be without being utopian, without laying out all of its exact structures and mechanisms for dealing with problems. With all that preface out of the way, let's get started on looking at each of those. So the first interface we're going to look at is the interaction of the principle of freedom and the unique. By my analysis, this gives us the concept of bodily autonomy. That is to say, everyone's body is their own. They are the one who makes all final decisions about what will be done with their body. That includes the right to change it or even harm it in any way that they like. Now, we will inspect as we go on here that has limits if it begins to affect others. However, this principle of bodily autonomy still underlies all of our conceptions about what an individual deserves. That is to say, if you are harming no one else with your actions, then you are free to pursue those actions in an anarchy. This would include the right to ingest any substance you like. This would include the right to change your gender. This would include the right to abort a child if it is gestating inside of you. This would include a lot of the basic rights that we consider that every individual should have in any good society. Next, I look at the interaction of the unique and ownness. So here we see the individual values in interface. And the property that I think this uncovers is the concept of individual power. This is, of course, a very broad category, but you might expect as much. This is the interaction of those individualist principles. This is the realm of personal apprehension. This is your personal property. This is everybody that you interact with, that is your friends and your family and those that you have bonds of love and affection with. Those would all actually be included in this aspect of individual power. Now, this is not exhaustive of all of those connections, as obviously we are going to see that there are a lot more connections to be discussed when we include solidarity and freedom and equality and so on. However, this is that simple principle that which you apprehend, that which you touch and interact with, it's sort of part of your selfhood. That is to say, an anarchy should not go about violating this basic principle of the expansion of individual power, once again, unless it comes to harm another person. Next, I look at the interaction of freedom and ownness. It seems to me that the interaction of freedom and ownness justifies the principle of usufruct. So some of you may not be familiar with this principle of usufruct, but usufruct is essentially that one owns something that they are using, that they are interacting with. And this actually leads to a different kind of property norm called usufruct property. And in this sense, we also get some part of collective ownership, because usufruct relations say that the only people who own any given thing are those who use it. So a factory can only be owned by the workers in the factory. It cannot be owned through absentee or private ownership in that sense. You can't own the factory because you can't run the factory all by yourself. A person can only quote unquote own something to the degree that they are engaged in using it and that they can fully apprehend and utilize it. This also means that if a person is not utilizing a thing for a considerable length of time, that they sort of give up their ownership of that thing. And someone who can better utilize that property will then gain ownership over that property through their de facto usage of that property. This means that even if, say, there was a group of workers that owned a factory beforehand because they utilized it, if they all stopped utilizing that factory, they no longer own the factory. The people who then go on to operate the factory after them would take ownership of it. We see here a very fluid conception of property rights. And it should also be said, this one goes really far back. Usufruct property relations are actually at the foundation of all leftist thought. This is the alternative to private property. Next, I want to look at the interface of solidarity and the unique. It seems to me that the interface of solidarity and the unique gives us Bookchin's principle of what he calls unity in diversity. So unity in diversity is basically this recognition that it is in the safeguarding of a society of diversity where people are different, where everybody has a different identity, they have a different past, they have different powers and capabilities, that we are actually better off. We don't need a society where unity is based around sameness. Instead, what we should be trying to do is safeguard a society where diversity is a strength. And it's interesting because this is another one of those occasions where we've sort of reproduced one of the pieces of complex systems analysis. And that is, systems with lots of diverse components are actually more powerful than systems that have very uniform components. Systems that have very uniform components, if some kind of disastrous choosing filter comes through, then that one kind of way of being just gets eliminated all at once. Whereas when you have a diversity of different kinds of agents, what that means is that only the ones that were affected by that sort of devastation, that sort of choosing filter that came through, then only those get pruned out in the process. And those who responded well to that will therefore then be strengthened. And I don't mean for this to in any way sound callous. This is just part of how reality works. There's always different kinds of hurdles and challenges that are going to confront us, both as individuals and as a collectivity. And if we have a bunch of extremely similar, uniform components, we are not going to be able to overcome a bunch of diverse difficulties that might face our society. Whereas if we have very diverse components, then we actually are going to be able to overcome those things by way of utilizing people's diverse and unique strengths. It's basically to say that we all have a unified interest in safeguarding that diversity. That diversity is not something that has to separate us from one another, but is instead something that unifies us together. The next is this interface between solidarity and ownness. And what it seems to me that this interface is expressing is the concept of social ownership. Given that this is about the expansion of one's ownness, their apprehension of the world, yet also it's about solidarity and bonds of cooperation, here we see that everybody actually achieves this maximal ownness in cooperation and sharing of resources. This also justifies why we might have much broader collective ownership, even of things that we don't immediately apprehend, through the use of some formal bodies and organizations, as these are representations of our ability to cooperate at larger and larger scales, and to share and reappropriate and to distribute the property that we all hold in common through our utilization and need. This then also leads us to the justification for socialism, which is worker ownership of the means of production. But I mean to say more broadly, social ownership of the means of production. Private property, after all, leads to the limitation of ownness, because now everybody doesn't have access to all of this collective property, which they very much have an interest in utilizing for their own good. If we don't share, we get far, far less than if we all did share. This is one of those many aspects where the system acts as more than the sum of its parts. Then we have the interface of equality and solidarity. Now, in my work, I've called this the principle of democracy or consensus. However, I understand that this word democracy is kind of a hot button issue among anarchists, so I've thought in later versions of this script to change this word to maybe free agreement or something so that we can develop a little more consensus upon the topic. However, I think which word we use is really irrelevant. What we're talking about is a concept. This concept, which we are calling democracy or free agreement or consensus, is all aimed at the same purpose. We are trying to get some form of very high agreement on the things that we all plan to do. We're trying to meet the desires of many different people through the utilization of a method where we all come together, we propose things, we deliberate upon them, we amend them to our needs, and we pass them such that we can satisfy our needs. This process of formal deliberation is incredibly important. The less formal this process of deliberation, the more that we are going to get people with all kinds of different ideas about how things are going to proceed. And even though, yes, we want lots of diversity in society, we don't want this situation where people's diverse interests and diverse needs act at the expense of other people. what we're trying to do is coordinate people's collective interests together. And so some form of formal deliberation, which some anarchists might call democracy, others will call free agreement, and in the modern day, we more tend to call consensus. Each of these are aiming at that specific need to deliberate and coordinate our actions together as to achieve our collective goals. The less that we are able to coordinate our actions together to achieve these collective goals, the less we're going to achieve those collective goals. And what we're going to have is situations where fewer and fewer people are benefited from some particular decision instead of us trying to take into consideration how we can have win-wins. If we just go about serving the self-interest of individuals or small groups, which are making these decisions without deliberation at a larger scale, this leads to a system where we undercut collective interest in the interests of individuals. So it leads to a society which further and further atomizes instead of coordinating at the necessary scales to get things that we all want. Also, this process of a formal, deliberative system puts us all in the room together such that we have to talk out our problems instead of just running off to the forest and, ignoring everybody else in society and just trying to get what we need individually. This places us in face-to-face situations where we actually have to recognize these other people in our daily lives, the people who will be affected by our decisions, and those people then can see how we are going to be affected by their decisions. If there is no such formal structure for deliberation, then you're going to end up with a system that is atomized and chaotic to a fault. And recall, as we discussed in the previous part, that being too chaotic or too ordered is bad. You want to rest on the edge of chaos. The next interface we want to look at is the interface between equality and freedom, that which I call communal power. So recall that equality is about equality of access to structural power, and freedom is about the largest degrees of freedom being available to any given person. So here, this is expressing the concept that we are all more powerful in coordination with one another, that our freedom to do things, the extent and variety of our power is actually increased by way of our access to structural power, and that together, through our collective access to this structural power, we all become more powerful, and socially, we become more powerful than just the addition of all of our individual pieces. I feel like in the previous interfaces I've already been covering that I've kind of already elaborated on why this is a good thing and something we should focus on, so I won't belabor the point too much here. Next, we have the interface between equality and the unique. And in my conception, this leads us to the concept of subsidiarity. Now, I recognize this word subsidiarity is not a common word, and probably almost no one is familiar with it. The concept of subsidiarity is pretty simple, and that is, issues should be dealt with in the smallest relevant body that is available. But I should add, the people who are the pertinent decision makers are always going to be those who are affected. You might recall this from previous videos that I've done. One of the key principles that guides the anarchist analysis is that those who are affected should decide. And this is directly in line with this principle of subsidiarity in a few different ways. One is that those who are affected, that is the smallest relevant unit that needs to make decisions. But this is also a richly mediated principle because those who are affected can expand considerably to include more and more people. In this sense, subsidiarity then expands as it needs to in order to include all of the people who have relevant knowledge and who will be affected by any given decision that we all come together to make. I think this principle is really, really important in that it manages a balance between complexity and legibility, you might say. It gives us a rule of thumb for how to involve different people in the decision-making process. And it tells us whether we have or have not included the right people in that decision-making process. The next is the interface between equality and ownness. And I believe this is the underlying justification for delegation. It's kind of a balancing principle between these two features. That is to say, it is a way for us to balance the expansion of individual ownness with everybody's need to have equality of access to structural power. In fact, it's this seeming friction that a lot of people point to in saying that anarchism cannot deal with specialization of labor. If indeed everybody's supposed to have equality of access to structural power, and we want to have a society which emphasizes bodily autonomy, how do we do that? The anarchist answers delegation. That is to say, the anarchist is not against people with expertise being put in positions where they can carry out their expertise without constantly having to check back with some sort of council structure. People can be temporarily or even permanently in some sense delegated to different tasks. We don't need to, for example, constantly ad hoc choose who the doctors in our hospitals are going to be. It's fine for us to say these people are delegated as doctors. However, this principle of delegation is distinctly different from how hierarchical systems deal with specialization of labor. In delegation, you are always able to revoke that person's position as a delegate. This is a collective decision. We sometimes call this temporary and revocable delegation. I think the important distinction to understand with delegation is that the person who is a delegate serves at the whim of this collective body, whereas in a hierarchical structure, that person is sort of embedded into that position by way of the decisions of somebody at the very top, or people that are in positions as hiring managers, for example, or in the Republic in the form of voting for representatives. This delegate never takes on decision-making power from these collective bodies. They merely carry out the decisions that were already made by those collective bodies. That is to say, they are given a mandate by the collective bodies about what the scope of things they are allowed to do is. The next interface I want to look at is solidarity and freedom. I called this interface mutualistic social power. I think it's best to think of this as the raw, unmediated power of society, sort of that spontaneous force of human beings to do things. This isn't mediated through power structures, but also I should say that it is harmonious. That is to say that this is not just a general social power, which would include a bunch of competing hierarchical relations between people. I would just call that social power more broadly, because it might include both hierarchical and horizontal structures. But here what I'm talking about is sort of that horizontal social power, what I'm calling mutualistic social power. This is just like you need a table and your friend has an extra table, so they give you a table. This is you see a person who is sick, so you come over and you help them. This is all of those social powers that we have that aren't formal and organizational in nature. And it should be noted that I think when I've talked to a lot of individualist anarchists, this is what they view as doing everything in an anarchist society. They think that this sort of mutualistic social power is going to spontaneously organize anything and everything that people need. You know, the same principle as I said, like someone needs a table, they get it from a friend. Like they seem to think that this is going to be the principle that organizes things at all scales. I personally, as you can see from having all of these interfaces, think that that is very insufficient for managing society. However, I will bracket that tangent. So that's all the two-way interfaces. However, I also went through and started thinking about some of the three-way interfaces. I should note that is about as far as it went. I did not go on to then analyze the four-way interfaces because the script was already getting kind of long. And also, when I started to inspect them, they really didn't seem like they were bringing much new to the table. It seemed like they were more or less now just agglomerating together into describing combinations of all of the features that I just laid out in those other interfaces. However, the three-way interfaces still remained pretty useful. They did continue to offer some insight. So I'm going to recount some of those three-way interfaces as well. The first is the interface between freedom, unique, and ownness. And as far as I can see, what this represents is the broader principle of autonomy, not just individual autonomy, but also collective autonomy. That is to say, every group of beings, insofar as that they are harming no one else and they abide by their agreements with other people, should also be free to do what they like within their collective. The same conception that led our discussion of bodily autonomy previously should also be held as a collective right. And the reason why this is now being included is because now it's including the principle of equality in that analysis. And recall, once again, equality is equality of access to structural power. That is to say, collectives should be able to determine for themselves what their unique interactions together are and what kind of society they want in miniature within their collective to be carried out. And you might think that this leads us to the concept of free association, but that one is coming up on another one of our three-way interfaces. Next, we have the interface between solidarity, ownness, and freedom. And in my conception, at least, when I thought through this three-way interface, this is basically a representation of communism. That is to say, when you think about how these three principles interact with one another, you have the reasoning for why we want a stateless, classless, moneyless society, number one. But number two, why we are trying to develop a situation where we are distributing all of the economic goods from each according to their ability to each according to their need. It's only under the solidaric conditions that we will ever all develop our ownness to the maximum extent. Solidarity, for obvious reasons, it's a society wherein everything is being distributed based on need. Ownness, because communism is about property relations, or rather the lack of traditional property relations. And freedom, because this leads to a society where we all have the greatest extent and variety of power too. Next, we have the unique, solidarity, and equality. And at least in my conception, this is what justifies the concept of confederation. And that's because confederation comes about by balancing the needs of unique groups of people while also still valuing the need for the balance of structural power and the extent of power too for everybody involved. What is confederation? Well, confederation is essentially when you take a bunch of smaller bodies and then you combine them into groups at larger and larger scales in order to deal with problems. Confederation is a way of valuing the autonomy of individual councils and their needs for subsidiarity, while also allowing all of these groups to coordinate together at all of the necessary scales to make collective decisions. Next is the interface of freedom, solidarity, and the unique. And I believe that what's taking place at this interface is the justification for complementarity. Here we have recovered another conception that Bookchin talks a lot about. Complementarity is the situation that arises when diverse components actually empower one another by their continued presence. That is to say, it is the situation where even though we are unique, we have different powers, we have different needs, and so on, these don't lead to a situation where we act at the expense of one another, but instead we are empowered through the way that we interact with one another. The fact that there is somebody whose special interest is being a dentist empowers me so that I don't have to go become a dentist. I can be interested in political theory or philosophy or being an artist. And we are all better off in this situation where we all focus on our own particular desires and needs. That is to say, this is a lot like what's happening in unity and diversity, but it's at a even larger, even structural scale. Next, we have the interface between equality, solidarity, and ownness. Next, we have the interaction between equality, solidarity, and ownness. And I believe this is the justification for what Bookchin calls the irreducible minimum. As I inspected this interface, I actually had somewhat of an issue trying to discern it from communism. However, I think what's happening at this interface is it's just describing why it is that everyone deserves some basic standard of living. I think this one's also really important in understanding how the society would model disability justice, because it basically lays out that no one can be deprived of some of the basic needs of any human being, and therefore the society has to meet those basic needs for anyone and everyone, including those who have different kinds of disabilities. However, it also includes the reasoning for why we have to watch after the sick and the infirm and the elderly. Basically, we have to set a floor below which no one can descend. Otherwise, we would just not have a livable and humane society. Then we have the interface of the unique, ownness, and solidarity. And I believe this is where we find the principle of free association. So what is free association? Free association is essentially the principle that people should not be forced to associate with those they do not want to associate with. That is to say, people should be free to disassociate from any organization or group of people that they would like to disassociate from. It also means that they can choose to associate with any given group of people, regardless of what anybody says about that. This leads to the possibility that there could be development of new federations if there were problems, as well as the defederation of given structures if those structures determined that they did not want to associate with broader confederations. Free association is a very important principle because without free association, then you are also not valuing a lot of the other things that were on this list, including confederation, autonomy, and many others. The last one is solidarity, equality, and freedom. And this one I call horizontal society. So in my videos, I talk about this concept of Cree-order. Cree-order is a concept that was developed by theorists Bickler and Nitzan. It's very similar to what Marx talks about with social reproduction. It is essentially the dynamic process by which some system or society maintains itself. It is all of the internal mores and norms which, when followed through, develop and redevelop. They enforce and reinforce the social conditions as they stand. And as far as I can see, that's what occurs in the interface of these three social anarchist values of freedom, equality, and solidarity. These are essentially the principles that we would have to follow in order to maintain a horizontal Cree-order. Together, these ensure that we have a society of cooperation and reconciliation instead of conflict. Moreover, this is the principle which suppresses the reemergence of hierarchical power structures. So that's it for the interfaces of the 5 values. For now, I think this does a very good job of laying out where all of these principles that anarchists advocate actually arise from. Moreover, what I want to emphasize is that we've avoided utopian thinking by instead asking ourselves, what does the universe require to function? What are the necessary aspects of a system that demonstrates emergence? And then we took the political theoretic parallels to all of those principles, and we looked at all of their interactions. And what we see when we inspect each of those interactions is that they produce all kinds of principles that the anarchists and social ecologists like Murray Bookchin had already found were necessary for a better society. Looks like Morticia is going to join us for the wrap up here. But what I'm trying to say is that when we look at the interactions of these 5 values, we see that once again, the anarchists have intuited a bunch of liberatory principles of the sort of society we might want to create. And this is important because in order for us to move from here to there, we have to know what there even looks like. And so what I've tried to do with the production of these values and this inspection is give us a grounded reasoning as to how these future conditions might look, so that we're not just kind of like reasoning pie in the sky about abstractions that have no fundamental structure or reasoning. Instead, we can be confident that what we've arrived at here is something very solid. It's based in scientific evidence and reasoning from complex systems analysis. It's also important because now that we understand what it is that we're trying to achieve, we can now begin discussing how we will achieve it. That is to say, the subject of the next videos is going to be revolution. However, for today, we're just going to leave it there because that was a lot, kind of a shotgun of concepts, so I hope that wasn't too exhausting or confusing in the process. You should go down into the comments and ask me any questions you have, and hopefully I'll be able to find time to answer them. Also, might I add, if you think the work that I'm doing here is important and you want to provide money for me to give food to these here kitties, you should go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount. $2, $5, $7, $10, or $20. Any amount that you can pledge will be enormously helpful and will absolutely lead to the betterment of this channel. Also, if you've been served up numerous videos from my channel, if this is like the 3rd or 4th time you've been recommended an Anarch video, you should go subscribe to the channel because this is what I do on this channel. And if you liked the video, you should go click like. Anyway, I think that is about it for today's video. Obviously, the cats are getting tired of me talking at a mic, so I think I'm going to wrap it up, and I'll see y'all next time.